The Eldridge Library stood like a forgotten monument in the heart of Salem, Massachusetts, its Gothic silhouette stark against the bruised lavender sky of late afternoon. Ethan, a lean young man in a faded gray hoodie, paused at the threshold, his hand resting on the cold wrought-iron handle of the heavy oak door. The air carried a faint chill, despite the lingering August warmth, and a subtle scent of aged paper, polished wood, and something indefinable like the memory of rainseed. Through the crack as he pushed the door open, his worn sneakers, slightly too big and scuffed at the toes, squeaked softly on the polished marble floor, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the library's interior. The space was a cathedral of knowledge, its vaulted ceiling soaring high. Above, adorned with intricate carvings of vines and leaves that seemed to twist and curl when caught in the corner of his eye. Stained glass windows, their colors softened by centuries, filtered the sunlight into fractured beams of amber, crimson, and deep indigo, casting kaleidoscopic patterns across the walls. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, glinting like tiny stars in the slanted light, each one a silent witness to the stories housed within these ancient shelves. Ethan's fingers fidgeted in the pockets of his hoodie, tracing the frayed edges of a small, spiral-bound notebook he carried everywhere, but rarely used. His glasses, slightly crooked from years of absent-minded adjustments, slipped down his nose as he glanced around, his dark eyes darting nervously. Libraries weren't his usual refuge. He preferred the predictable hum of his computer, the rhythmic flicker of code on a screen, or the quiet solitude of his cramped apartment, where the world's chaotic symphony of voices and expectations couldn't overwhelm him. But today, something had tugged at him, an inexplicable pull, like a thread caught in his chest, leading him to this place. He'd stumbled across a mention of the Eldridge online, buried in a forum thread about Salem's hidden corners. Locals called it a relic, a place where stories lingered like ghosts, their whispers trapped in the pages of forgotten books. For Ethan, whose autism often left him feeling like a stranger in a world of unwritten rules and unspoken cues, the idea of a library that held voices no one else could hear felt like a quiet promise, a faint beacon in the fog of his isolation. He stepped deeper into the library, his breath shallow, almost reverent. The silence here wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a presence, heavy and expectant, like the moment before a storm breaks. Rows of bookshelves loomed on either side, their dark mahogany frames stretching toward the ceiling, each shelf packed with volumes whose spines bore faded gold lettering and titles in languages Ethan couldn't decipher. Some were in Latin, others in scripts that curled and looped like ancient runes, their forms both alien and alluring. The air was cool, carrying a faint mustiness that spoke of centuries spent guarding secrets. Ethan's gaze swept over the shelves, lingering on the intricate details of their carvings, faces of scholars, mythical creatures, and flowers that seemed to bloom in the wood. Each shelf felt alive, as if it held not just books, but the weight of the lives that had written them. A librarian sat at a desk near the entrance, her silver hair pinned in a tight bun, her eyes sharp but not unkind. She glanced up as Ethan passed, her gaze lingering as if measuring him against some unseen standard. Her hands, lined with age, rested on an open ledger, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Ethan ducked his head, avoiding her eyes, and quickened his pace, his shoulders hunching instinctively. Human connection, even fleeting, often felt like navigating a maze with no map, each glance or word a potential misstep. He could feel her watching him, not with judgment but with a quiet curiosity, as if she knew something he didn't. The thought made his skin prickle, and he hurried toward a spiral staircase tucked in a shadowed corner, its wrought iron frame spiraling upward like a promise of solitude. The staircase was narrow, its steps worn smooth by countless feet, and each one creaked under Ethan's weight, the sound echoing faintly in the vast space. The air grew cooler as he climbed, the scent of old books intensifying, mingling with a faint trace of wax and leather. At the top was a small alcove, half hidden behind a curtain of shadow, cast by a towering shelf. The space felt like a secret, a pocket of stillness carved out of the library's grandeur. The walls were lined with more books, their spines faded but ornate, and a single table stood in the center, its surface scarred with age, its edges worn smooth by countless hands. A lone book rested on the table, its leather cover cracked but intricate, embossed with a swirling design that seemed to shimmer under the dim light filtering through a nearby window. The window itself was small, its stained glass depicting a solitary figure, a scholar, perhaps, or a storyteller holding an open book, the colors muted but vibrant in their decay. The The light that passed through it cast a soft glow over the alcove, bathing the book in a pool of amber. Ethan hesitated, his fingers hovering over the book. He wasn't one for impulsiveness. His mind craved order, patterns, the comfort of predictability, but this book felt different. It was as if it had been placed here for him, waiting patiently through years of dust and silence. He could feel its pull, a quiet insistence that made his pulse quicken. He pulled out the chair, its legs scraping softly against the wooden floor, and sat down. The wood groaned under his weight, a sound that felt almost like a greeting, as if the library itself acknowledged his presence. His hands, still trembling slightly, reached for the book. The leather was cool under his fingertips, its texture, rough yet strangely inviting, like the skin of some ancient creature. As he opened the cover, a faint creak broke the silence, and the pages inside revealed themselves yellowed, their edges brittle, but the ink elegant, handwritten in a script that flowed like a river across the paper dot. As Ethan's eyes traced the first line, a strange sensation bloomed in his chest, a low hum. Not quite a sound, but a vibration, like a voice stirring deep within. The words on the page seemed to shimmer, their edges blurring as if alive. For a fleeting moment, he saw a curl of shadow rise from the paper, faint and formless, like smoke caught in a draft. His heart thudded, loud in the quiet, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned closer, drawn into the book's orbit, as the library around him seemed to dissolve, leaving only him, the open page, and the whisper of something ancient, waiting to be heard. The alcove felt smaller now, the walls closer, as if the library itself was leaning in, eager to share its secrets. Ethan's breath caught, his fingers tightening on the page, and for the first time in years, he felt a spark of something unfamiliar. Fear, not confusion, but a quiet, trembling anticipation. Ethan sat frozen in the alcove of the Eldridge Library, his fingers still resting on the open book, its brittle pages trembling slightly under his touch. The air in the small, shadowed space felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The faint hum that had stirred in his chest when he first read the opening line lingered, a vibration that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. The library's silence was no longer just a backdrop, was a presence, thick and expectant, wrapping around him like a shroud. The single stained glass window above the table cast a muted glow, its colors deep blues and reds faded by time across the scarred wooden surface. But as Ethan's eyes adjusted to the dimness, he noticed something new, a soft, golden light emanating from the book itself, faint at first, like the flicker of a dying candle, but growing steadier with each passing second. He blinked, pushing his crooked glasses up his nose, convinced it was a trick of the light or his tired eyes. But the glow persisted, delicate and warm, seeping from the edges of the pages as if the ink itself were alive. The light wasn't harsh or blinding. It was gentle, like sunlight filtering through autumn leaves, casting a halo around the book that pushed back the shadows of the alcove. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his hands hovering over the open page, unsure whether to pull away or lean closer. He wasn't used to things that defied explanation. His world was one of logic, of patterns, of lines of code that behaved as they were told. But this was different. This was something that felt like it belonged to another world, one he'd only glimpsed in the stories he'd read as a child. Curled up in his room to escape the noise of the outside, the book's leather cover, cracked and worn, seemed to pulse faintly under the glow, its embossed design a swirling pattern of vines and stars shimmering as if etched in gold. The handwritten script on the page, elegant and flowing, seemed to move, the letters curling and shifting like ripples on water. Ethan's heart thudded, loud in the stillness, but he couldn't look away. The glow intensified, spreading across the table, illuminating the scratches and grooves in the wood, each mark a testament to the countless hands that had touched this surface before him. The light didn't just illuminate it, felt alive, warm, like a whispered invitation. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and brushed the edge of the page. The moment his skin made contact, the hum in his chest grew stronger. No longer just a vibration, but a voice soft, indistinct, like a murmur carried on the wind. The words on the page began to blur, not from strain, but as if they were dissolving into the light. In their place, faint images flickered, like shadows cast by a lantern. Ethan squinted, his breath shallow. As the images took shape, a young woman in a flowing dress, standing in a garden under a moonlit sky. A man hunched over a desk, quill in hand, his face lined with grief. A child running through a field, laughter trailing behind her. The scenes were fleeting, gone before he could grasp them. but each one carried a weight. An emotion that pressed against his chest, joy, sorrow, longing. Ethan's hands tightened on the book, his knuckles white. He wasn't imagining this. The book was speaking to him, not in words but in feelings. In fragments of lives that weren't his own. The alcove seemed to shrink, the shadows retreating, as the golden light grew brighter, spilling beyond the table to touch the walls. The bookshelves around him, their spines faded and dusty, seemed to lean in, as if drawn to the light. The air grew warmer, carrying a faint scent of parchment and something sweeter, like honeysuckle or old roses. Ethan's mind, usually so quick to categorize and analyze, faltered. He didn't know what this was, but he felt it deeply, in a way he hadn't felt anything in years. His world was often a blur of sensory overload, a cacophony of sounds and faces he couldn't pass. But here, in this moment, there was clarity. The light, the book, the hum, they were a language he could understand. One that didn't demand words or gestures he couldn't give. He turned the page, his movements careful, almost reverent. The glow followed, brighter now, and with it came a new sensation, a voice not heard but felt, weaving through his thoughts. It was soft, fragmented, like a half-remembered dream. "I loved her," it said, not in words but in a rush of warmth and ache that made Ethan's throat tighten. He saw the flicker of a memory, a man standing at a window, watching a woman walk away, her silhouette fading into the rain. The image was so vivid, so raw, that Ethan's eyes stung. He blinked rapidly, pushing the feeling down, but it lingered, heavy and real. He turned another page, and the voice shifted, now carrying a different weight, anger, sharp and cold, like a blade. A new image formed, a family at a table, voices raised, a door slamming shut. Ethan's hand shook, but he kept reading, unable to stop. The golden light pulsed, its rhythm matching the hum in his chest, and the alcove seemed to dissolve entirely. The walls, the shelves, the stained glass window, they faded into a haze of gold, leaving only Ethan and the book. The shadows that had flickered on the page began to take form, rising like smoke to hover above the table. They weren't just images now, they were presences, faint and translucent, their faces blurred but their emotions sharp. A woman's laughter, bright and fleeting. A man's quiet despair. A child's unbridled joy. Each one brushed against Ethan's mind, not overwhelming but inviting, as if asking him to listen, to understand. He felt their stories, not as words but as waves of feeling that crashed over him, gentle but relentless. Ethan's breath hitched, his fingers gripping the book tightly. He wasn't used to this two feeling so much, so deeply, without the buffer of logic or distance. His life was one of careful control, of avoiding the chaos of human emotion. But here, in this alcove, with this glowing book, he couldn't hide. The light seemed to seep into him, illuminating corners of his mind he'd kept locked away. He saw himself, fleetingly, in the shadows, a boy who'd spent years building walls to keep the world out, who'd learned to navigate life by memorizing its patterns, rather than feeling its pulse. The book, the light, the voices, they were breaking those walls down, not with force but with a quiet, insistent pull. He turned another page, and the glow flared, bathing the alcove in warmth. The voices grew clearer, not louder but more distinct, each one carrying a story, a life, a moment. Ethan leaned forward, his glasses slipping again, his eyes wide behind them. The library was gone, the world was gone, and all that remained was the book, its light, and the stories it held. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt connected, not to people, not to the world, but to something deeper, something that spoke in the language of the heart. And as the golden light enveloped him, he knew he couldn't turn back. Ethan sat hunched over the glowing book in the Eldridge Library's alcove, his fingers trembling on the brittle pages as the golden light pulsed brighter, its warmth wrapping around him like a second skin. The hum in his chest had grown into a steady rhythm, a cadence that felt like a heartbeat not entirely his own. The air, in the small, shadowed space, was thick with anticipation. The silence of the library no longer just a void but a canvas, waiting for something to emerge. The stained glass window above cast its muted colors, faded blues and reds. The scarred wooden table, but its light was now overshadowed by the book's glow, which seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each turn of the page. Ethan's glasses fogged slightly at the edges, his breath shallow as he leaned closer, drawn into the book's orbit like a moth to a flame. The handwritten script on the page shimmered, the ink seeming to writhe, and the faint shadows that had flickered earlier were no longer formless, they were coalescing, gathering substance in the golden haze. As he turned the next page, the light flared, and a soft gasp escaped his lips. Above the book, where the air had been empty moments before, a figure began to take shape. It was faint at first, like mist caught in sunlight, but it grew clearer with each passing second. A woman, middle-aged, stood before him, her form translucent yet vivid, as if woven from the light itself. She wore a simple dress, its hem frayed, its color a muted green that seemed to shift in the glow. Her hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back loosely, strands falling across her shoulders. But it was her eyes that held Ethan captive, deep and sorrowful. They carried a weight that made his chest ache, as if her grief had reached across time to press against his own heart. She stood motionless, her hands clasped loosely in front of her gaze fixed not on Ethan, but on something distant, something lost. The alcove seemed to fade, the walls and shelves dissolving into a golden fog, leaving only Ethan, the book, and the woman. The hum in his chest deepened, no longer just a vibration, but a voice, a woman's voice, soft and fragmented, weaving through his thoughts like a half-forgotten lullaby. "I waited too long," it said, not in words, but in a rush of feeling that flooded Ethan's senses. Images flickered in his mind, unbidden but vivid. A small house by a river, its windows glowing with candlelight. A letter, its ink smudged, with tears left unopened on a table. A man's back as he walked away, his footsteps heavy on a wooden porch. The scenes were hers, not his, yet they felt as real as his own memories, each one carrying a pang of regret that made Ethan's throat tighten. He stared at the woman, his hands gripping the book's edges, the leather cool under his fingertips. The golden light pulsed in time with her presence, as if she were tethered to it, a ghost drawn from the pages. Her eyes, still fixed on that unseen horizon, glistened with unshed tears, and Ethan felt an urge to speak, to ask who she was, what she had lost. But his voice caught, trapped in the maze of his own mind. Words had always been difficult for him, slippery things that refused to align with the thoughts he wanted to express. Instead, he let the silence speak, his gaze locked on her, willing her to continue. The woman's lips parted, but no sound came, only a wave of emotion, raw and unfiltered, that crashed over him. It was sorrow, yes, but also love, fierce and unyielding, the kind that lingers long after its object is gone. The images in his mind shifted. The same woman, younger now, laughing in a garden, her hands brushing against roses as a mantle, with a gentle smile, watched her with adoration. The scene was bright, filled with sunlight, but it carried a shadow, a knowing that this moment would not last. Ethan's fingers twitched, wanting to hold on to the image, to keep it from fading, but it dissolved into another, the woman alone, older, standing at the same window, her hands pressed against the glass as rain streaked down outside. The ache in her eyes was unbearable, and Ethan felt it echo in his own chest. A mirror to the loneliness he'd carried for years, the isolation of a mind that didn't fit the world's rhythm. The book's glow intensified, bathing the alcove in a warmth that felt almost alive. The woman's form grew sharper, her edges more defined, but her eyes remained distant, as if she were trapped in her own story, unable to see him. Ethan's heart raced, his mind struggling to process the flood of emotions, not his, yet somehow his, as if the book were weaving her life into his own. He turned another page, and the woman's figure flickered, her hands reaching out, as if to grasp something just beyond her reach. The voice in his mind grew clearer. "I should have told him," it said, the words not spoken but felt heavy with regret. The images came faster, now a letter written but never sent, a door left open in hope, a silence that stretched too long. Ethan's eyes stung, his vision blurring, but he couldn't look away. Her pain was a thread, pulling him closer, binding him to her story. The alcove was gone now, the library a distant memory. The golden light enveloped everything, a cocoon of warmth and sorrow that held Ethan and the woman in its embrace. The shelves, the table, the stained glass window, they had all vanished, leaving only the book and the woman's translucent form. She moved, her hands unclasping, one reaching toward the air, as if to touch a face that wasn't there. Ethan felt her longing, sharp and piercing, and for a moment, he saw himself in her, a boy who'd never known how to reach out, who'd built walls to keep the world at bay. The realization hit him like a wave, and he gasped, his fingers tightening on the book. He turned another page, and the woman's form shimmered, her eyes finally meeting his. For a fleeting moment, she saw him not as a stranger, but as someone who understood. The sorrow in her gaze softened, replaced by a quiet gratitude, as if his presence, his willingness to listen, had given her a moment of peace. The golden light pulsed once more, then began to fade, the woman's form dissolving into the haze. The hum in Ethan's chest quieted, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The book lay open before him, its pages still, the glow dimming to a faint shimmer. But the woman's story lingered, etched into his mind, a fragment of a life he'd never lived but now carried. Ethan sat back, his breath uneven, his hands still trembling. The library was silent once more, but it felt different, now less empty, more alive. As if the stories it held were watching, waiting for him to turn the next page. Ethan sat motionless in the alcove of the Eldridge Library, his eyes locked on the open book before him, its pages still faintly aglow with a golden light that pulsed like a living thing. The air in the cramped space was thick, heavy with the residue of the woman's story, the middle-aged figure who had materialized moments ago. Her sorrowful eyes and translucent form now dissolved back into the ether. The hum that had filled his chest lingered, a soft echo of her voice, her regrets, her unspoken love, still reverberating in his mind. The library's silence was no longer just a void. It was a presence, charged with the weight of countless, untold stories, each one waiting in the shadows of the shelves. The stained glass window above cast its dim, fractured colors across the table, but the book's golden glow outshone it, a beacon in the dimness that seemed to call to him, urging him to go further, to dive deeper into whatever this strange, impossible moment was. His hands rested on the edges of the book, fingers brushing the cracked leather cover, its swirling design of vines and stars, still faintly warm under his touch. The glow from the pages was steadier now, not flickering but flowing, like a slow river of light that spilled over the table and pooled in the air around him. Ethan's breath was shallow, his heart pounding in a rhythm that felt foreign, as if it was syncing with the pulse of the light itself. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and order, was unraveling, struggling to make sense of the impossible. He'd spent his life avoiding the unpredictable, the unexplainable. His autism made the world's chaos unbearable at times, a storm of sounds and faces he couldn't pass. But this light, this book, felt different. It wasn't chaotic. It was alive, intentional, and it was speaking to him in a language he didn't need words to understand. He leaned forward, his crooked glasses slipping down his nose, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The golden light seemed to beckon, its edges shimmering like the surface of water, inviting him to cross a threshold he couldn't see. His fingers twitched, hovering over the open page, where the handwritten script had blurred into a soft haze of gold. The images of the woman's life, her laughter, her tears, her loneliness still lingered in his mind, vivid and raw, as if they'd been etched into his memory. He could still feel her, a presence that hadn't fully faded, her sorrow and love clinging to him like damp air after a rain. And now, the light seemed to promise more, not just her story, but something deeper, something that might unlock the parts of himself he'd kept buried. Ethan's hand moved, almost without his permission, reaching toward the light. His fingers trembled, the tips brushing the edge of the glow, and a jolt ran through him, not painful, but electric, like touching a live wire that carried emotion instead of current. His eyes widened, his breath catching as the light rippled under his touch, sending waves of gold across the page. The hum in his chest surged, no longer a murmur but a chorus, a cascade of voices too faint to distinguish but heavy with feeling. His face, usually guarded, softened into an expression of pure astonishment, his lips parting slightly as the light seemed to wrap around his hand, warm and alive, like a hand reaching back to meet his dot. The alcove vanished, the walls and shelves swallowed by the golden haze, the table, the chair, the stained glass window. They were gone, leaving only Ethan and the book, suspended in a sea of light. The glow wasn't just light anymore. It was a current, a tide of memories and emotions that flowed through him, pulling him under. Images flickered in his mind, faster now. Not just the woman's, but others, fragments of lives he'd never lived, yet felt as if they were his own. A sailor standing on a ship's deck, the salt spray stinging his face as he whispered a prayer to the stars. A child hiding under a table, her small hands clutching a doll as voices argued above her. An old man carving a piece of wood, his fingers steady but his heart heavy with unspoken words. Each image carried a pulse of emotion, hope, fear, love, loss that crashed over Ethan. Overwhelming, but not suffocating. Like waves that lifted him rather than drowned him. His hand sank deeper into the light, the glow climbing up his wrist, his arm, as if drawing him into the book itself. His face, illuminated by the golden radiance, was a study in wonder, his eyes wide, reflecting the light like twin stars, his mouth open in a silent gasp. The voices grew clearer, not in words but in feeling, each one a thread weaving into a tapestry of human experience. Ethan's heart raced, but he wasn't afraid. For the first time in his life, he felt connected not to the world outside, with its noise and chaos, but to something deeper, something universal. The light was a bridge, linking him to the stories trapped in the pages, to the lives that had poured their hearts into the ink. He saw himself, fleetingly, in the flood of images, a boy sitting alone in a crowded classroom, his hands fidgeting, with a pencil as voices buzzed around him, incomprehensible and overwhelming. A teenager staring at a computer screen, the glow of code his only solace. A young man standing at the edge of a party, watching people laugh and talk, feeling like a ghost in their midst. The images weren't just memories, they were pieces of him, fragments of his own story that he'd never dared to face. The light held them gently, not with judgment, but with understanding, as if saying, "You are part of this too." Ethan's other hand reached out, both now immersed in the golden glow, and the book seemed to respond, its pages trembling as the light flared brighter. The voices grew louder, not in volume but in clarity, each one distinct yet part of a whole. A woman's laughter, bright and fleeting. A man's quiet resolve as he faced a storm. A child's wonder as she chased fireflies in a field. Ethan's breath hitched, his eyes stinging with tears he didn't understand. He'd spent so long avoiding emotion, building walls to keep it out, but now it was here, undeniable, flowing through him like the light itself. His face, bathed in the glow, was no longer just astonished, was alive, open, as if the light had unlocked something inside him. The library was gone. The world was gone, and Ethan was adrift in the golden sea, his hands still touching the light, his heart pounding in time with its pulse. The stories weren't just in the book anymore, they were in him, their emotions weaving into his own, filling the empty spaces he'd carried for so long. He didn't know how long he sat there, hands immersed in the glow, face alight with wonder, but he knew he couldn't stop. The light was a promise, a door to a world he'd never dared to enter, and for the first time, Ethan felt ready to step through. Ethan stood alone in what had once been the alcove of the Eldritch Library, but the cramped, shadowed space was no more. The golden light that had first spilled from the open book on the table had grown into a radiant flood, dissolving the boundaries of walls, shelves, and ceiling until he was suspended in a boundless sea of shimmering warmth. The light pulsed like a living thing, its rhythm syncing with the beat of his heart, a steady cadence that felt both foreign and familiar. His hands, still tingling from their earlier brush with the glow, hung at his sides, fingers flexing as if reaching for something just beyond grasp. His crooked glasses caught the light, reflecting it in fractured glints that danced across the lenses. And his face, usually guarded, a mask of careful control, was open, unguarded, his dark eyes, wide with a mixture of awe, wonder, and something deeper, something like surrender. The hum that had stirred in his chest when he first opened the book had swelled into a symphony, a chorus of voices that weren't heard but felt, weaving through his thoughts like threads of emotion, joy, sorrow, hope, regret, love, loss, one distinct yet part of a vast, interconnected tapestry. The book he had been holding was no longer tethered to the table. It hovered before him, its cracked leather cover embossed with swirling vines and stars that shimmered in the golden glow, its pages fluttering as if stirred by an unseen breeze. The handwritten script within pulsed with light, the ink alive, flowing like a river across the yellowed pages. But it wasn't alone. Other books had risen from the shelves that once lined the alcove, their faded spines and worn covers now radiant with the same golden luminescence. They floated around Ethan, orbiting him like celestial bodies, their pages rustling softly, each one releasing tendrils of light that curled and danced in the air, weaving patterns that seemed to whisper secrets. The library's silence, once heavy and expectant, was gone, replaced by a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere, and nowhere a sound that wasn't sound but feeling, wrapping around him like a warm, living embrace that pulsed with the weight of countless lives. Ethan's breath came in short, uneven gasps, his heart pounding in time with the rhythm of the light. The alcove, the library, the world outside Salem, Massachusetts, they had all vanished, leaving him in this golden void, where time felt suspended, where the rules of his carefully ordered life no longer held sway. His autism had always made The world felt like a storm, too loud, too bright, too chaotic. A barrage of sounds and faces he couldn't pass, emotions he couldn't navigate. But here, in this sea of light, there was no chaos. The glow was overwhelming, yes, but it was gentle, guiding, like a hand leading him through a labyrinth he'd spent his life avoiding. His fingers twitched, reaching out instinctively, and as they brushed the air, the light responded, rippling like water under his touch, sending waves of warmth through his skin that made his breath catch. The books circling him began to open, one by one, their pages turning slowly, deliberately, as if inviting him to peer inside. Each one released a new thread of light, and with it came a flood of images, memories, lives that weren't his own, but felt as real as the heartbeat thumping in his chest. A sailor's weathered hands tying a knot on a storm-tossed ship, the salt spray stinging his face as he whispered a prayer to the stars, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. A young woman painting in a sunlit attic, her brush trembling with the weight of dreams she'd never dared to voice, her eyes bright with hope, yet shadowed by doubt. A child hiding in a closet, his small hands clutching a worn book as footsteps thundered outside, his heart racing with a fear he couldn't name. The images poured into Ethan's mind, each one carrying a pulse of emotion, fear, longing, love, resilience that wove into his own thoughts, filling the empty spaces he'd spent years guarding with walls of logic and routine. His face, bathed in the golden glow, was a canvas of wonder, his eyes reflecting the light like twin pools of amber, wide and unblinking. His lips parted, a silent gasp escaping as the book spun faster, their pages a blur of ink and light that seemed to hum with life. The voices, the feelings grew clearer, not in words but in sensations that crashed over him like waves, gentle, yet relentless. A mother's fierce love as she held her child through a fevered night, her hands steady despite her own exhaustion. A soldier's quiet resolve as he wrote a final letter home, his words steady even as his heart broke. A poet's trembling joy as she found the perfect word to capture a fleeting moment, her breath catching with the weight of creation. Ethan's chest ached, not with pain but with fullness, as if his heart were expanding to hold it all, to carry the weight of lives he'd never lived but now understood. He raised his hands, palms up, and the light gathered around them, wrapping his fingers in a warm, golden embrace that felt like a pulse, alive and vibrant. The books slowed their orbit, their pages still turning, and Ethan felt a shift, a connection, not just to the stories but to himself. Images of his own life flickered among the others, unbidden but vivid. A boy sitting alone in a crowded classroom, his hands fidgeting with a pencil as voices buzzed around him, a cacophony he couldn't parse. A teenager staring at a computer screen, the glow of code, his only solace in a world that felt too loud. A young man standing at the edge of a park, watching families laugh and play, feeling like a ghost in their midst, unseen and untouched. The light held these moments gently, not with judgment, but with understanding, as if whispering, your story matters too. You belong here. Ethan's breath hitched, his eyes stinging with tears he didn't try to blink away. The books floated closer, their light merging with his, and for a moment, he felt weightless. As if he were part of the glow itself, a fragment of the same radiance. The hum in his chest was no longer just a chorus, it was a song, a tapestry of human experience that wove him into its threads, that welcomed him without demanding he change. His face, illuminated by the light, was no longer just was alive, open, vulnerable in a way he'd never allowed himself to be. The stories weren't just in the books anymore, they were in him, their emotions weaving into his own, filling the hollow spaces he'd carried for so long, the places he'd kept locked away out of fear or habit. The golden light pulsed, brighter, now, and the books began to drift upward, their pages fluttering like wings, their glow intensifying until it seemed to fill every corner of the void. Ethan stood still, his hands outstretched, his heart pounding in time with the rhythm of the light. The library, the world, the noise and chaos of his life, they were gone. And he was alone in this radiant sea, yet not alone at all. The stories surrounded him, embraced him, their light weaving through him like a thread through fabric, binding him to something vast, something human. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt seen, not as a puzzle to be solved, not as a stranger to be avoided, but as a part of something greater, a keeper of stories, a vessel for their light. And as the golden glow enveloped him completely, warm and unending, he knew he was no longer just a reader, he was a part of the story, ready to carry its light into a world he was only beginning to understand.